Welcome to the Glenn Beck program, surprisingly yet in another studio tonight. I mean, I like the little orphan around here. It's like the 5 o'clock show. We'd like a studio, please. Tonight, I want to talk to you a little bit about the churches in America, because the churches have always played a role, not only here, but abroad as well. Are the churches in America vibrant? Are they dead? Are they on life support? What are they? And are we getting the right story? I have somebody on in about a half hour that you're going to meet. He is the reverend of the largest church in the New York City area. They have over 30,000 members here, largest church in the New York City area. It's conservative. How come we didn't know that? Stick with us. Hello, America. I want to tell you about this guy and this book. Bonhoeffer, pastor, martyr, prophet, spy. I've talked about Bonhoeffer a couple of times on this program, and he is loved by the left. Oh, they love him. In fact, here's a year with Dietrich Bonhoeffer, forward by Jim Wallace. Hi, Jimmy. Jimmy loves the show. Jim Wallace, of course, is the guy who's leading that Christian boycott against me. I think that's what Christ would do. Leading that Christian boycott against me in this program and running ads about what kind of Christians would watch or listen to Glenn Beck. Thanks, Jimmy. I love you too. There's a problem, because the left likes to take Dietrich Bonhoeffer and say that he is a social justice guy. This book says, no, not so much. Who is Dietrich Bonhoeffer? He's a guy that you should know. This is a book that you should read. Why? I don't believe in coincidence. This is a book that the author told me I was compelled to write, didn't want to write it. I have to tell you, I didn't want to read about a guy who was being tortured by Nazis either. But it came into my hands, strangely, and I felt compelled that I should put it on the air. But then I got sidetracked onto Gandhi, and I was looking for an expert on Gandhi. And the author of this book happened to bump into somebody on my staff, and he was reading this book at the time. And he said, hey, you know, Dietrich Bonhoeffer was fascinated by Gandhi, said that Gandhi held the answer. I called Eric right away. Eric Metaxas, he is the author of Bonhoeffer, Pastor, Martyr, Prophet, Spy, and said, can you help me out with Dietrich Bonhoeffer and Gandhi? And tonight we want to spend a little bit of time talking about the churches in Germany and look for patterns here, because it's important what happened to the churches in Germany, but really important because this guy stood and he's being recast now. Tell me, Eric, about Dietrich Bonhoeffer.
Bonhoeffer.
Yeah.
Bonhoeffer. Yeah, there's a lot there. There's a lot there, but Bonhoeffer's, it's a fascinating thing, because I wrote a book about William Wilberforce called Amazing Grace, and people kept asking me, who are you going to write about next? Some people said, about whom are you next going to write? Those people were correct, by the way. I like the word whom. I'm a Yale English major. But I thought there's only one person who captures my imagination, my heart, my mind, the way William Wilberforce did, and that's Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Bonhoeffer, in a nutshell, for folks who don't know, was a German pastor and theologian who got involved in the plot to kill Adolf Hitler.
But he didn't, wait, back up.
That's the short, I'm leaping ahead to say that's who he was.
Okay.
But to talk about how that happened, that's why we're here.
Right, because he's a guy who didn't want to be involved, tried to wake the churches up. They now say, people like Jim Wallace say, that he said that Christianity was dead, and he was a social justice guy. Right.
Well, it's almost hilarious, because when you look at the facts, the reason I say this, so I got into writing this book not knowing what I would find, because I'd heard these things about Bonhoeffer. People have presented it that sort of toward the end of his life, he kind of makes a weird left-hand turn and becomes a post-Christian humanist, whatever that means, I don't know. But somehow drifts away from biblical faith in Jesus Christ. That's not true. I didn't know until I did the research on the book, and what I discovered actually stunned me, because the opposite is true. His faith becomes stronger and stronger. 18 hours before he is sent to his death in Flossenburg concentration camp, he has a service for his fellow prisoners. He preaches a sermon. I mean, this guy went to the gallows with his faith in Jesus intact. And so none of that is true, and his legacy has effectively been hijacked by the hard left, really by agnostics and atheists.
Okay, this is, America, this is important for you to know. This is an important book for you to read, because he was compelled to write it, prompted, dare I say. I felt prompted to bring the story to you, and we were in my office a couple of months ago, and I said, I don't know what it's supposed to be used for, but somebody is supposed to get their hands on this book, and maybe it's you. This guy was amazing, and a hero. Did you see Valkyrie? You saw that?
Sure.
Yeah. Amazing story and fearlessness.
Yeah.
That was this kind of guy.
Oh, yeah. Well, no, the whole story of Valkyrie is in this book. That's why it's a thick book. There were many plots, or I should say there were many attempts on Hitler's life. The final one, I'll get to that in a minute if we want to go through the timeline.
Because I don't think
it all culminates in that.
The Hitler part is not as important to me as the standing up to the churches and saying, no, no, no.
Right, that's right.
Look what's happening.
Right. And that's why in the title I call him a prophet, because the prophet speaks to the church. The prophet is trying to get the people of God to be the people of God.
So what was happening at the church? What was happening in the churches early in Germany?
Well, you got a number of things going on. First of all, you have theological liberalism. Okay, Bonhoeffer, he wanted to be a theologian at age 14. He decides to go to Berlin University, which is the finest place in the world to study theology, literally. So he goes there, but he is not a theological liberal. He is a Barthian. People can look that up, Karl Barth. And Bonhoeffer realizes that the God of the Bible is alive. He's not dead. It's not just these are texts we're studying. But most of the German theologians at that time looked at it as though, you know, all that stuff has been sort of disproved, so we're just going to study the texts. Bonhoeffer says, no, there's a God behind the texts, and he wants us to know him personally. So the climate of Germany in the first decades of the 20th century was a climate of, you have two things going on. Number one, theological liberalism, where people don't really believe this stuff, but they continue to go through the motions.
In many ways, what we have here now.
Well, of course, absolutely. And this always happens to the church. You have these seasons, it waxes and wanes, where you have people who effectively take it for granted. I mean, Germany, in many ways, the parallels to the U.S. are stunning. And I didn't realize it till I did the research for this book. But when you have a country that thinks of itself as a Christian nation, the downside is you begin to take it for granted. You go, well, we're a Christian nation. So Germany thought, hey, we gave the world Martin Luther, and he gave the world Protestants, and we're it. So we don't have to do anything.
When I saw speeches, I went to a museum of film, and I saw old speeches of Adolf Hitler that he gave really early, and they are loaded with Jesus Christ stuff. I mean, they are loaded with Christianity.
He wanted to sell himself as a Christian because he understood that if really not Christians, they were Gentiles, so they were not Jews, but they were not Christians. They were pagans, basically. But he understood that he's dealing with a population that is vaguely Christian. Germany is a Christian nation, and that if he presents himself as bitterly opposed to Christianity, he will lose his power.
Right.
So he plays, I mean, this is the danger. When you have a nation that is sort of Christian in a very surfacey way, not mentioning any names, but the initials are USA. If you have that kind of a thing going on, you're very susceptible. So Hitler comes into the situation, and he basically plays the conservatives. He basically says that, you know, I'm against degenerate Bolshevism, I'm against the communists, I'm for values, and so on and so. So he talks the talk, but he is fundamentally opposed to actual Christianity. But he hides it because he knows that if he reveals it, he loses everything.
When did Bonhoeffer first figure him out? Because he was the first guy from the beginning,
From
right?
day one. And I think it's because Bonhoeffer's father was a scientist, and the whole Bonhoeffer family was trained to think rigorously. They were not able to be fooled. They were really some of the finest minds in Germany. This is an amazing family, and I go into that in the book. But they were trained to think clearly. So number one, Bonhoeffer thinks very clearly. Number two, his family was very well connected in social circles in Berlin, so they knew people who were in the know, and they knew before Hitler became chancellor who he was, that he's a vulgar, fundamentally anti-German, anti-Christian narcissist, a maniac, basically. They knew this. The whole family knew it. They all got involved in the plot to kill Hitler.
When Hitler became chancellor, Bonhoeffer was on the air, and was he taken off the air?
Yeah. Well, 2 days in January 31st, 1933, Hitler becomes chancellor. 2 days later, 3 days later, Bonhoeffer goes on the air and gives a radio speech. And in the speech, he basically dissects the whole idea of the Führer principle. That's another chapter in the book. This idea, it was very popular in Germany, of the Führer, the leader. I won't go into it now, but Bonhoeffer dissects it, really rips it to shreds. And the people thought that the Nazis cut off the broadcast, but now it doesn't seem that that's what happened. But the bottom line is, he gives this speech days after Hitler becomes chancellor. You want to talk about brave. I mean, this was not the way the winds were blowing in Germany at the time, but from that day on, all the way till his death 12 years later, Bonhoeffer is vehemently against the Nazis.
On Kristallnacht, he again stands up. His family stands up.
Well, I think it's important to talk about the fact that right in the early 30s, the German pastors still believed there was an opportunity to turn the tide, right? In other words, you had most of the pastors just kind of laid down and rolled over, but there were a few, and Bonhoeffer was one of the leaders, who understood that we've got to stand up to the Nazis, because it's important to say the Nazis were trying to take over the church. They were totalitarians. They wanted to take over everything, and there was no separation of church and state in Germany. So Hitler becomes the head of the state, so he's thinking, well, we can take over the church, but we're going to do it carefully. We're not going to announce that we're taking over the church. We're going to do it carefully. Bonhoeffer sees this, and, excuse me?
How did he do it?
Well, basically infiltration. In other words, there were Nazis everywhere, and they began to take over the levers of power because it was the state church. And Bonhoeffer was, again, like the canary in the coal mine. He was one of the first people to say, wait a second, what they are saying is completely antithetical to the scripture. They are, for example, looking at things along racial lines. Bonhoeffer said, you can't do that. My best friend is a Jew who became a Christian, and now he's a member. He wants to be he's training for the clergy. The Nazis said, oh, you have Jewish blood? You can't be a member of the clergy. This is a state-run church. You're Jewish, you're out. Bonhoeffer writes a seminal essay. This was really the key. In 1933, writes something called The Church and the Jewish Question, where he, with his incredible mind, dissects this idea and shows that what the Nazis are bringing to the church, this racial prism through which they're seeing everything, is fundamentally opposed to Christianity. And he was one of the leaders. It led to the writing of this famous thing called the Barmen Declaration, where all of these pastors, including Martin Niemöller, Karl Barth, stood up and said, no more. We are separating from the Nazified Reich Church. We are separating. That's no longer the Church of Jesus Christ. Bonhoeffer is one of the leaders in this, and every pastor in Germany that signed on to the Barmen Declaration was now part of what became known as the Confessing Church. And in this story, the Confessing Church are basically the good guys, and then you have the Reich Church, which is run by the Nazis, and the Nazis marked, every pastor in the Confessing Church was a marked man. Basically, they were sent to concentration camps. They were sent to the front lines when the war came. They were decimated, completely decimated.
Bonhoeffer comes to America a couple of times.
Twice, yeah.
And this is where it gets dicey, because he goes to
the first time you're talking about?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Social justice church.
Yeah, not really. No, not really. This is interesting. In 1930, he comes to America. He goes to Union Theological Seminary. Now, he already had his doctorate at age 21, so he's not really interested in learning theology, but he comes. He wants to spend a year in America before he gets ordained. So he comes here, and an African-American friend of his, a fellow student, invites him to Harlem, to Abyssinian Baptist Church. Bonhoeffer goes there, and what he sees in this church, parentheses, actual Christianity, he has never seen before. He sees thousands of people worshiping Jesus Christ, people who, a suffering congregation, I mean, African Americans in 1930, he sees them singing with joy. This is real. This is not just, we're not playing church. This is not just Gentiles, what you do on a Sunday. This is the real deal. It changed him. He couldn't believe it. He goes back to Union and he says, I'm so moved, I'm going to go back to that church every single Sunday. So imagine this blonde, bespectacled Berlin academic going up to Harlem every Sunday, not just to worship, but to teach Sunday school, to get involved in the lives of these people. So he was, during this year, fundamentally changed. He was theologically a Christian before this, but his heart was changed. He gives his heart to Jesus.
And when he went back, he tried to, correct me if I'm wrong, he tried to do gospel music, right? He brings back records of the quote-unquote Negro spirituals to Germany, because he says, you've got to hear this. He was moved. I mean, he could see that something had happened, that these African Americans were, their faith was totally different.
They were here, not here.
Well, definitely. And
I mean, many of the Lutherans weren't even here either. You know, they were kind of nowhere. But the fact is that Bonhoeffer, he sees this, he comes back, and when he starts teaching in Berlin University, in theology department, he starts talking about the Bible as the Word of God.